I remember the first time Uncle Haroon called Amin poor like he was naming a fault. We were at my mother's cicada-slickened kitchen, tired yellow light, the kettle that never quite steamed, and my family gathered like a council to judge a marriage. They had arranged themselves exactly as they always did. Chairs on the sides, smiles that catalogued and ranked. It was the kind of room where people felt it safe to be small and mean. Amin, Uncle Haroon said, eyes on him as if assessing a building's foundation. What do you do for a living again? He answered with the calm of someone who does not need to be loudly announced. I fix boats, he said. I do carpentry when there's work. I'm learning to repair engines. That was supposed to be the end of it, the way adults share facts about themselves and move on. But my family insisted on making facts into verdicts. My sister Layla laughed thin and sharp. A boat fixer, she said. How quaint. And how will that pay for a wedding? It was said like a question with no answer, like a test with only one correct response. Despair. I clenched my fist under the table. I had already seen Amin's hands, calloused, patient, hands that could coax a stubborn hinge into soft life. I had watched him work at dusk in his small garage, breathing slowly, measuring twice, cutting once. He carried getting things right like a quiet religion. He loved things by fixing them. That evening I wanted to say to my family that money is a temporary color on a person, not their bones. I wanted to say that the way he looked at me made me believe in small mercies. Instead, I watched him stand, smile at my mother, and fold his hands as if he had been baptized in humiliation and still kept his dignity. We married in early winter, when the sky was a pale sheet and the sea softened into a long gray inhale. My mother embroidered a veil with thin gold threads and people said all the correct things. My family took very little time to say what they thought in polite sentences, and then went home to say kinder things to their mirrors. They mocked him in private glances and public jokes. Being poor in my family meant being almost a story to ridicule, a cautionary tale told with condiments and wine. Amin did not retaliate. He did not scream or make himself small. He simply worked. He took odd jobs and hardware pinches and long nights in the workshop. He saved with a stubbornness that looked like patience, and that patience had a slow, terrible strength. When I say we were poor, I mean the world measured us by what we did not have. But in the dim light of our small kitchen, we had mornings that tasted like toast and coffee. We had a bed with sheets that fit us like a promise. I think I always believed in two things, that my family would give me ease and that love would be enough. I was wrong about both. Love was enough for some days and not for others. My family's approval did not budge spontaneously. It required a transaction, a transfer of value I was not ready or willing to make. Rising tension. The first time our doorbell rang at night and brought the wrong kind of grief, I woke to the sound of rain as if someone had poured lead onto the roof. Amin was home late. He had worked on landing a job restoring a derelict fishing boat, a good steady piece that could change the slow faceless math of our life. He arrived muddy, smelling like diesel and sea, his jacket streaked with salt. In one hand he held a small shabby envelope. It was an invoice for supplies. He placed it on the table and sat down without speaking. I asked what was wrong and he looked at me like a man who had just read the map of his life and found a new road. They want to sell the boat, he said. The owner, his brother, died. He's been offered twice its worth by someone from the city. The man will scrap it for parts. Amin's voice had a crack like rope under strain. I thought maybe I could save it, restore it, keep the men employed. It could be the start. The start. The word meant more than money. It was a future shaped by work, not charity, not a one-time gift, but the building of something solid. I remember my chest filling with light and terror at the same time because saving the boat would require money we did not have. It would demand risk, borrowing from the bank or borrowing from my family. Borrowing from my family in my world meant walking into a courtroom of looks. I thought of Uncle Haroon's hands and Layla's laugh and felt the pressure of the town pressing against our door. We argued that night like two people who love each other but do not have the same maps. He wanted to try. I wanted security, a slow accrual of peace. We'll be fine, he said, as if conjuring peace would make it real. If we fix that fisherman's boat, we can get work for months. People come back to those who save their livelihoods. His eyes were alight, fragile with hope. I thought about my mother's voice, About the meetings with relatives who framed life in terms of inheritance and appearances. I thought about what it meant to fail in that family's eyes. But when I looked at Amin, so quiet and sure, it felt like standing beside a cliff and finding a handhold I did not know I had. I agreed to a loan from a small lender who smelled of tobacco and counted with slow, sharp fingers. The lender charged us more than he should have. He also required collateral, the little patchwork of savings we had and the old silver brooch my grandmother left me. I signed the papers because Amin's faith looks like wind, unseen working. The work began in a cough of noise and blue light. Amin and a couple of hired hands worked on the boat, scraping decades of salt into heaps. Night after night, lanterns burned in the yard, shadows moving in choreographed concentration. Nor would come sometimes from the hospital, where she worked long shifts, to bring food and stay until midnight, to hand Amin a cup and say, "You're too tired." Amin would just smile and return to the hull like a man answering his life's calling. It was during this time that I first saw the way my family's contempt could become appetite. They continued to mock him, but now it wore a new edge. A greedy interest that felt like stalking. Layla visited more often, always with clever questions about timelines and costs. Uncle Haroon made an offer, quick, thinly veiled as help, but with strings that would tie Amin's hands. "We can invest," he said, "and I will take a portion of the boat. Think of it as a partnership." He spoke the way a surgeon might explain the excision of a small limb. Amin refused. He refused quietly, without fireworks, and this refusal seemed to puzzle them more than a fight would have. It was a refusal not of their money but of their terms. He wanted the boat to be his, owned by those who worked it. He wanted dignity in the long run, not mercies that came with a price tag attached. We began to get work for other boats. Men from the quay came with creeks and tails, and Amin set to work with the same care he put into everyday things. Money began to move like a shy animal toward us. Not a flood, do not imagine riches, but a stubborn stream. People brought small favors, and small favors collected like a rumor into something practical. We paid off the lender in time and kept the brooch hidden until the debt was settled. Meanwhile, inside me something else shifted. The more Amin built, the more my family watched. Their scorn softened into speculation. They asked for estimates and then pretended interestingness. Layla, sharp and bright-eyed, started to appear at the yard with a thermos of tea and screaming advice on paint colors. I can still see the exact way her shoulders hunched when she told me she had doubts, like someone pulling a cloak close. She called her doubts concern, and I called them what they were, appetite. One evening, when the sky was a thin slice of purple, Uncle Haroon came down the hill. He stood at the gate like a judge with a new script. He congratulated Amin with a smile that did not reach his eyes and then asked casually, who would be allowed to work on the pier once the boat was relaunched. He wanted a stake. He wanted public credit for private benefit. The town loves modesty until modesty stops producing spectacle. Then it wants to consume it. Amin answered that he wanted the pier to remain the pier, open to anyone who needed to mend their life. It was a strange, soft answer for such a heavy man. I felt something swell in my chest, pride and fear in equal measure. Uncle Haroon left with a face like a closed ledger, and for the first time I saw his patience crack. That was when the small, sharp retributions began. A man who owed Amin a favor suddenly produced a creditor's note. A supplier we had used for years raised prices overnight. The community that had once hummed with support now produced friction like a field scheduling a storm. It was as if some invisible tally had been created and people were scrawling small debts against us. We kept going. Nights were full of the smell of resin and sawdust and the sound of the tide. A steady metronome that kept us from drifting into despair. We did not learn to be wealthy overnight. We learned to count in increments. Each job gave us a cushion, then a bigger one. People who had mocked Amin started to stop by uninvited. They wanted the repaired or they wanted the patch on a hull. They wanted the gentle silence of a man who could put broken things back together. The more they needed him, the angrier some were. Needing implies debt. Debt invites control. I began to notice the looks, Layla's thin smile when she asked, "Have you thought about moving to the city?" As if the town were a trap and success could only be exported. Uncle Haroon, however, played an older game. He began to offer help again, but now always in the form of advice. which is how control dresses when it wants to be pleasant. You should take contracts that guarantee faster payments, he would say. You should sign with people who have assets. He said it as if Amin had invented the idea of being cautious. Amin, whose eyes had lived through salt and storms but always carried something like inner light, refused again. I don't want to shack up my work under someone else's name, he told me. It was not pride. It was a belief in doing the work on his own terms. If I patch a boat for a man, I want to know I did it honestly. That honesty began to be a problem for some. I could feel the town rebalancing itself like a machine with a new gear inserted. The louder it hummed, the more friction there was. Love in our house became the part of life that kept us from losing our sense of humor. It made us small rebellions against a world that measured us in labels. Climax. The day the ambulance came, it felt like a thick, wet page tearing out of the book of our lives. I was working in the kitchen when Noor called my name in a voice that sounded thin and distant, as if she were speaking from far away. She told me Amin had been at the pier, fixing a winch, and a cable had snapped. He had fallen. The words rearranged themselves in my mouth into a scream. I ran. The town's light that afternoon was glassy and dishonest. People clustered at the pier like onlookers in a small private movie. There was the metallic tang of cold grease in the air. Amin lay on the dock. His shirt was dark with blood. His face was folded inward like a paper bird that had been crushed. The cable had snapped and his head had taken the worst of it. At the hospital, where Noor worked constant night shifts and had the authority to know pain too well, they moved like a choreography of urgent acts. Machines blinked and breathed and beeped. I felt like someone watching myself from a distance, watching my hands find his, watching a doctor say intracranial hemorrhage like a verdict. There were murmurs about surgery and the risks and an insurance form that read like an accusation. The world had a way of turning private emergencies into public arithmetic. Uncle Haroon arrived in his expensive coat. He pressed his hand against my shoulder in a way that felt like a measuring. "This is bad timing," he said, as if time had a preference. Money became immediate. The lender we had once paid now appeared in the story because hospital bills needed legs. Layla's voice was steady, efficient, too efficient, like someone who sorts through grief by cataloging garments. "You need the best surgeon," she said. "We can make calls. We can. We needed a surgery. We needed consent. We needed money. The hospital can ask many things at once. For signatures, for promises, for names to blame, for checks." In the thin antiseptic light, I thought of all the times my mother had laughed at Amin's hands. I thought of all the times I had longed for family warmth and instead found conditional warmth, warm only when heat came with obligations. Amin's surgery was long. Noor sat beside me, her fingers woven through mine like an anchor. She whispered little facts into my ear to keep me grounded. The surgeon emerged with tired eyes and the posture of someone who had seen coincidence and chance mix into human consequence too often to be surprised. "He's stable," the surgeon said. "But we need to be clear. Recovery will be slow. There may be deficits. We did what we could." That sentence was a thin rope on a precipice. We had to walk across it. In the days that followed, the town's machinery of rumor and concern whirred. People came to see and to probe. My family rearranged themselves into volunteers and visitors and critics. Some brought casseroles. Some brought advice on therapists and herbs. Layla brought magazines and folded her hands as she recommended specialized clinics in the city. Uncle Haroon came late at night and talked of philanthropy with hands that never opened. I felt in those hours a terrible clarity. The world's mood had shifted yet again. Those who once sneered now positioned themselves as indispensable. Some of them spoke of how one learns to come together, as if they had not been absent when we needed silence. They took pictures, they offered candles, they wrote checks with a calm that smelled like calculation. Amin came back to us slowly. He returned with a shaved patch of hair and a bruise that lived like a map across his temple. His speech was halting at first. The left side of his face seemed to have lost its knowledge of muscles. Months of therapy followed, physical, speech, subtle re-education of the body. Noor became our steady presence. Not as charity but as an ally. She would come after shifts, her uniform rumpled and her eyes soft, and push gently when Amin felt a wall ahead of him. We learned to celebrate small victories. The first time he spoke clearly again, we took a tiny pleasure as if it were a stolen prize. He learned to brace himself on the pier, to feel the sea's pulse beneath his boots. He returned to work slowly, at first with small tasks, then with more. He learned to use his right hand for what his left could not yet perform. I watched him relearn his own body like a poet learns a new language. Awkward, committed, delighted by small then bigger possibilities. These months were also the months when my family's true colors showed themselves. They wanted to be close when his needs were visible. They offered attention and gifts and, more insidiously, control. Uncle Haroon proposed that we move Amin to a private clinic in the city and promised to cover costs with one condition: that he would manage the boat business while Amin recovered. He framed it as help. Layla told me bluntly that moving to the city would be better for therapy and for opportunities. She asked if we had considered selling the boat and taking a sure payout. I understood the offer and the angle behind it. It was a modern version of the old scarcity argument. Let someone with money take charge because money knows how to manage. But Amin's hands could not be managed by accounts and ledgers. His dignity would be a ledger entry if the business passed into someone else's name. I fought with strange ferocity. I argued with relatives who spoke in the kinds of sentences that hide the shape of greed. I argued not because I wanted the credit but because I saw the way Amin's eyes lit when he spoke about the pier. I saw how his fingers wanted to test a line again, to feel a muscle respond. To hand this over would be to tell him that his life's work was a commodity to be parceled. At the center of the conflict was a simpler truth. My family had mocked Amin for being poor, but when the tide turned they wanted to lay claim to him like a salvage crew. It felt like theft dressed in kindness. There were nights when I lay awake and wondered if I had been proud for pride's sake. Was I insisting on autonomy because love required it, or because I wanted to prove my family wrong? Was I fueled by stubbornness or a desire to protect Amin's dignity? The answer was both. Human motives rarely come singularly. One evening, after a particularly sharp argument with Uncle Haroon, Amin said something that sealed my conviction. We were alone on the rooftop, the town below like a sleeping creature. He turned to me in the navy of night and said, "If they take it, Ramina, I will still wake up. I will still do my work." His voice was like a rope thrown in the dark, steady and meant to be trusted. But I would rather fall and climb than be made small in slow comfort. His words were a knife of clarity. He did not want pity. He wanted to be chosen, not rescued. We refused Uncle Haroon's offer. We accepted help from no one but the hands we trusted. It was a dangerous decision. It kept us honest. It kept us poor by certain accounts. It also held our dignity like a small, stubborn flame. Then the town did something it does with sudden success. It turned a man's humility into a pedestal. People who had mocked Amin began to rely on him. They came to his yard for jobs. A small shipping company from a neighboring town contracted him for a restoration that required patience and precision. They sent a down payment that doubled our usual monthly income. The boat was finally launched one golden morning when sunlight made every droplet on the hull look like scattered coins. People applauded. They softened. Even Layla smiled with something like genuine warmth. Uncle Haroon gave a measured congratulations, keeping his eyes on the ledger of things. It felt like the town was folding us into itself like a finished piece of knitting, the kind of belonging people often imagine will mean they have arrived. But belonging never quiets the world. It alters it. It creates stakes. It also brings cracks we cannot see. One day, months after the launch, a storm came like the end of a sentence. It ripped at ropes and schedules. A freighter from the city crashed against a barbed reef outside the bay, and men were hurt. The freighter's owner demanded an urgent, near-impossible repair. He offered a contract so large that it would put Amin, and by extension our lives, squarely under someone else's brand. He dangled the kind of money that turns bargaining into an offer no one can refuse. This is the moment where I learned that choices are rarely pure. They are complicated. They are a mixture of hunger and fear and ideals. The freighter could legitimize Amin's work permanently. It could offer security for years. But there was a price. The owner demanded that Uncle Haroon be given a managerial role for security. He wanted a recognizable name as a front. The offer smelled like compromise. It smelled of the same thing my family had sold as generosity. Amin hesitated. I saw him weighing the scales in his chest. Layla pressed for the contract. "Imagine the work we could have," she said. "Imagine sending the children to better schools." She spoke of futures as if they were catalogs. We debated in the small room where light fell like a folded letter. Amin's hands were resting on his knees. He looked strangely to me, small and at the same time immense, like a lighthouse that had learned to bend. If we sign and Haroon manages, our work will be under someone else's vision, he said. It will not be ours to craft. The decision felt like choosing which limb to give up. We were hungry. We were afraid. We were tired from the surgery and the months of therapy and paying off lenders and giving credence to village gossip. What we chose was not purely romantic. It was a mixture that only exists in the honest light. Survival spruced with stubbornness. We said no. And I will tell you now, saying no felt like a gamble that required a kind of faith most people teach themselves not to have. It was frightening. It was also necessary. For a while that no saved us. The freighter hired another shop. Uncle Haroon cried all the little crocodile tears of men who lose an investment. Layla called me pragmatically disappointed, as if my stubbornness were a textbook case. But then something worse began, revenge in the shape of negligence. The freighter's owner, now without our work, used his influence. He encouraged buyers to favor other sheds. He whispered about our lack of scale. A rumor started that Amin's methods were old-fashioned and unsafe. Contracts evaporated. Our accounts thin like tea left too long. The town felt different. People who had once knocked on our door asking for a favor began to pass us by. A man we had helped in the past, returning a job later, turned his head as if to avoid the shame of gratitude. It was small acts. The shop who had always sold us nails closed up. The supplier who had been kind to Amin for years forgot to deliver on time. The market's economy had turned against those who refused the fallacy that money equaled ownership. I remember standing in the yard, hands in my pockets, feeling something inside me lift and fall like the tide. I understood then, with a cold crystalline clarity, that life does not reward moral purity. It complicates it with costs. The town's new rules were not the law of the sea but of social currency. Pity could buy influence. Bargains could buy breath. In that bitter season, Amin worked like a man who has chosen a difficult path, steady and relentless. He took small repairs and small jobs. He started teaching a young apprentice how to stitch canvas and replace rotted planks. The apprentice was eager in a way that made me ache. The hunger in him was a mirror of something I had once wanted to be. Day by day we rebuilt, not because the town apologized but because work itself has a logic that eventually pays. Slowly, months later, small jobs accumulated. A boat needed only a well to leave the port, and in doing so, it paid us enough to buy bread. Another small contract for a fisherman's net came. The apprentice grew skillful. There were nights in the kitchen where money was counted and stories were told. We learned to be frugal without self-contempt. During all this, Uncle Haroon did not stop making offers. He would come by and speak about how he had always believed in giving people a hand up. His promises sounded like ropes with knots that only he knew how to tie. Once, when he stood at the workshop gate and watched Amin work with hands that had already begun to move more fluidly than before, he spoke softly. "You could have had security. I could have helped." His voice was an attempt at tenderness. Amin looked up. His face was lined, older than before, shaped by recovery. He wiped sweat with the back of his hand and said simply, "We had what we needed, each other." The sentence was not triumph but a quiet statement of fact. Uncle Haroon left without speaking. I think he understood, finally, that he had been rejected. He also understood that the town's appetite for our story had grown complicated. They needed what Amin could do, but they wanted to keep the profit and the credit. Resolution. Time has a way of making proofs out of pain. Years passed. The apprentice, now skilled, left to start his small business. He thanked Amin in a way that had no hunger in it, a simple respect. My family learned to temper their words. Layla married poorly and later came to us when life frayed. She would eat at our table and we would listen as she spoke of failed ventures and quiet loneliness. I did not gloat. I understood the human need to buckle sometimes under the world's weight. Uncle Haroon grew quieter. He would sometimes stand at a distance and watch Amin walk along the pier, hands tucked into his pockets, the sea swallowing the horizon like a secret. Once, he crossed the street and came to the yard with a small parcel, a hand-carved cup, rough and honest. He pushed it across to Amin. "I made this." he said, as if his hands had learned a craft and humility at the same time. It was a small human thing. Amin accepted the cup and drank tea from it the next morning. His smile a small private victory. We did not become rich. We did not conquer the world. But we reached a kind of peace that had a texture, linen instead of silk, steady and warm. Amin's reputation grew beyond the town. People from other ports called for his work. We expanded, modestly, with a borrowed loan that we negotiated fairly and repaid without drama. We kept the boat. We kept our dignity. The twist, the part of the story that feels inevitable yet surprising, came years later. Not as an explosion but as a quiet rearrangement. One spring morning when gulls drew delicate sketches in the sky and the sea was a bright, trembling coin, a young boy walked into the yard with a notebook and a courage that looked like hunger. He sat at our gate and watched the men work, breathing with the rhythm of their measured strokes. He was bright-eyed, earnest. His name was Yusuf. He told Amin he wanted to learn to fix boats. He had been part of a family that had mocked his father for washing cars, poor and useful. He had been laughed at too. Amin looked at him. He saw the familiar hunger. He saw a child that reminded him for a moment of the man he once was, patient, skilled and mocked. Amin invited him to work that week. Weeks turned into months. Yusuf learned slowly, and with a kind of devotion that made me think of seedlings in spring. He stayed even when work was scarce. He stayed even when the pay was pinch. He learned how to sand a board until the wood felt like skin. His hands, like Amin's before him, became maps of quiet living. One day, Yusuf's father came to the quay. He was a man with a face shaped by hard work and by habits of making jokes that masked shame. He watched his son shoulder boards and carry buckets. He watched quietness instead of the expected humiliation. He watched the way people in our yard treated the young boy with respect. There was a change in him then, a recalibration. He came to Amin and said nothing for a long time. Then he placed his hand on Amin's shoulder and said simply, "Thank you." The man's gratitude was not a public performance. It was a small private thing, not a trophy but a change. It was the form of repair that no ledger can register. It was the human equivalent of a boat finally righted. Later that year, when the town celebrated its yearly festival, people who had once mocked Amin told stories about the yard, as if they had always believed in it. I think some of them did not notice their own transformation. The town, always hungry for stories, preferred a tale with the right ending. But in the crowd, Uncle Harun sat quietly and watched as Yusuf, now a young man, guided a small wooden skiff into the water. His hands were steady, and his posture was open as if the world had taught him something important, and he had decided to keep it. I think the twist of my life is not that the poor became rich or that the mockers were made small. The twist is more tender and more awful. The people who once laughed learned to depend on what they had scorned, and in doing so they changed, sometimes gently, sometimes awkwardly. There is a kind of justice that moves not as punishment but as a rearrangement of needs, of respect, of fate. It is not punishment. It is an education in humility. One evening after the festival, Uncle Harun and I stood on the pier and watched the sun melt into the sea. He had come to apologize once, in a way that did not ask for anything back. He said simply, "I was wrong about you and about him. I thought money was the same as worth." He sounded tired and younger than his years. I placed a hand on the rail and looked at him. I did not accept his apology as a trophy. I accepted it as a conversation finally opened. "People make mistakes," I said. "They fix what they can. We do this with hands, not with ledgers." He nodded, and in his nod there was a kind of relief that had nothing to do with money. He had been taught by life, the slow, patient school of loss and need, that a man's value is measured in his craft and his heart. Amin stood a few paces behind me watching the horizon, his silhouette like a small lighthouse. He had become the man my family once mocked, the man they now depended on for mending boats, for securing livelihoods, for being a steady presence in a town that had been careless with people. He had done it without making himself hard. He was not a man who shouted his victory from rooftops. He simply kept working steady and true. The last twist of all was private and simple. One morning, months after that apology, Amin came into the kitchen with a small box. Inside was a simple ring, plain, unadorned. He placed it on my finger and said with a laugh like foam, "It took us longer than I thought, but you were right to believe." The ring fit. It did not glitter like a fortune. It fit like a truth. I am not telling you this story to make a sermon of poverty or virtue. People hurt people and people help people in equal measure. What I want you to know is that life is complicated. People who mock you may one day need you. People who give you gifts may ask for your life in return. The only true anchor is the choice to be honest with your hands and your heart. I am Ramina. I married a man my family murmured about. He became the man they depended on. I watched it all happen, the slow, aching arc from mockery to reliance. And I learned that dignity is not the currency of the world but the quiet measure by which a life can be fixed. And here is the small, sharp twist of time that feels inevitable. The same family that mocked Amin for being poor came to depend on his skill, and in their dependence they discovered humility. But the greater surprise is ours. We discovered that to be poor in the score of money is not the same as being poor in character. Amin's poverty had been a small thing next to the vast wealth of his patience and skill. In the end, that was the currency that bought the town's respect. We kept our small house on the slope. Sometimes at dusk I walked to the pier and watch Amin work. I watched the apprentice, now an equal, learn from him the small secret art of mending. The sea keeps its steady song. The town continues to speak in different voices. People change slowly. They do not always become kind, but sometimes they become wiser. And when Layla or Uncle Haroon or anyone else from the family visits now, they bring a different tone with them. It is softer, less full of irony. They ask how to help with a project or what paint to use or how to get a stubborn rivet to behave. They still have their old fault lines, but they have new reasons to cross over them. And sometimes, if the weather is right and the sea is calm, they sit quietly and watch the men work, and they learn without much fuss that labor is a kind of prayer that brings people closer than sympathy ever could. The story is not tidy. It does not end with a tidy moral that fits on a card. It ends with a cup of tea shared between people who were once strangers, with a ring that was earned by patient days and nights, and with a pier that holds more stories than it did before. It ends with the knowledge that the people who once mocked my husband for being poor now depend on him, and that dependence has opened them, slowly, into humility. We remain a small town. The sea still speaks like an old language. But under the sound of waves, there is now a new rhythm, one made by hands, by honesty, by the quiet decision to say no to easy compromises and yes to hard, honest work.